She pressed the broken pistol against his chest, with both hands, shaking so badly the barrel rattled against his coat buttons. Her lip was split. Her eye was swollen shut. And still she whispered, voice barely above the howling wind outside, "Please, just look." Then she pulled back the torn edge of her coat with her free hand, and what Samuel Carter saw burned into him like a brand pressed against raw skin. Because that was exactly what it was. Someone had marked this woman like she was cattle, like she was property, like she was nothing. If this story already has your heart, please subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single part. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Montana. 1878, and find out what one whispered request cost two strangers everything. Samuel Carter had not spoken to another human being in 11 days. That was how he preferred it. He kept count. Not because the silence bothered him, but because counting gave his mind something clean to do, something that didn't bleed. 11 days since the supply run into Harlan Creek. 11 days since the general store owner's wife had looked at him with that particular kind of pity that people reserve for men who've clearly lost something they're never going to find again. He'd taken his flour, his salt pork, his ammunition, and he'd ridden back up the mountain without a word to anyone. 11 days of exactly what he wanted. Peace. But the storm that rolled down off the Rockies that January night wasn't interested in what Samuel Carter wanted. It came fast and mean the way Montana winters always did, 1 hour of warning sky and then a wall of white that turned the world into nothing. He'd been checking his trap lines along the eastern ridge when the temperature dropped 15 degrees in under an hour, and by the time he turned his horse Gideon back toward the cabin, the snow was coming sideways, and he couldn't see 10 feet in front of him. Gideon knew the way. Samuel gave him the reins and trusted the horse's feet. That was the first thing that saved Clara Whitmore's life, though neither of them knew it yet, because if Samuel had been navigating himself, he might have cut south toward the shelter of the pine break. He might have come to the cabin from a different angle entirely. He might have opened the wrong door or no door at all, and the woman hiding inside his home would have frozen before morning with her baby pressed against her chest and a broken pistol in her fist. But Gideon went the way Gideon always went, straight up the northern slope and around to the lean-to, where Samuel kept the feed and the extra firewood. Samuel unsaddled him in the dark, by feel alone, rubbed him down with a burlap sack, forked hay into the rack, and pulled his coat tighter against the cold that was working its way into his bones. Then he walked to his cabin door. He stopped with his hand on the latch. Something felt wrong. Samuel had lived alone on this mountain for going on 4 years, and a man who lives alone learns to read the specific silence of his own space the way other men read weather. He knew every creak of this cabin. He knew the particular way cold air moved beneath the door when nobody had been inside to warm the place. He knew the sound of an empty room. This wasn't it. He stood very still in the howling dark and listened. And there it was, so faint, he almost convinced himself it was the wind. A sound like someone trying very hard not to breathe. Samuel didn't draw his rifle. He drew his pistol instead, faster better for close quarters, and he eased the latch up slow with his left thumb and pushed the door open with his boot. The cabin was dark, except for the faint orange glow of coals in the fireplace. He'd banked them before he left that morning, and they'd been burning low for hours. Just enough light to see the rough outline of the room. His table. His 2 chairs. His bunk against the far wall. And in the corner beside the cold stove, a shape that didn't belong. "Don't come in." The voice was a woman's voice, barely louder than the fire's dying breath, and it was shaking with something that was equal parts cold and terror. "I've got a gun." Samuel stood in the doorway, with snow driving against his back, and he said very calmly, "Ma'am, that's my cabin you're in." "I know." A pause. "I'm sorry. I didn't have anywhere else." He could see the pistol now as his eyes adjusted. She was holding it out in front of her with both hands, and the barrel was trembling. She was sitting on the floor in the corner with her back pressed to the wall and her legs drawn up, and there was some bundle pressed between her knees and her chest. Something she was curled around. "That pistol loaded?" Samuel asked. Another pause. Longer this time. "The hammer's broken," she admitted. Her voice cracked on the last word like she hated herself for saying it. "But I'll throw it at you." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. Then he holstered his gun, stepped inside, and shut the door behind him against the storm. "Fair enough," he said. He crossed to the fireplace without looking at her, crouched down, and started working the coals back to life. He kept his movements slow, deliberate, the way you move around a spooked horse, no sudden gestures, no loud sounds, nothing that might tip a fragile thing over the edge. "You're going to freeze before morning if you don't get closer to this fire," he said to the coals. "I'm fine where I am." "No, ma'am, you ain't." He added a thin split of pine and blew on the coals until a small flame caught. "I can hear your teeth from here." Silence. Then slowly, and he didn't look, he just listened to the scrape of her boot against the floor. She moved. Not close, maybe halfway across the cabin. Close enough that the growing firelight caught her face, and Samuel got his first real look at her. She was young, mid-20s maybe, dark hair plastered against her cheek from the wet. One eye swollen nearly shut, the purple of it deep and old enough to be 2, maybe 3 days along. Her bottom lip had a cut that had healed over and reopened, and there was a smear of dried blood along her jaw that she'd tried to wipe off and hadn't quite managed. But what Samuel noticed most was the way she held herself. She was hurt everywhere, and she was terrified, and she was holding that broken pistol like it was the only thing keeping her upright, but her spine was straight. Her chin was level. She was looking at him directly, not hiding her face, not shrinking. That was not the posture of a woman who had given up. "What's in the bundle?" he asked, still not looking at her directly. "My son." Samuel added another piece of wood to the fire. "How old?" 6 weeks. 6 weeks. He kept his voice flat, neutral. "You carried a 6-week-old baby through that storm." "I didn't have a choice." He looked at her then, looked at her square. And she met his eyes and didn't flinch. And something in that, the straightness of her spine, the steadiness of her gaze, even through the fear, made him feel something shift in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. He couldn't have named it right then. He just knew it unsettled him. "Is he alive?" Samuel asked. "Yes." And for the first time something cracked in her voice. Not broke cracked, like she'd been holding a note too long and her breath finally gave. "He's cold, but he's breathing." "Let me see." "No." Instant. Fierce. "Ma'am?" He kept his voice quiet. "I ain't going to hurt a baby. I want to see if he needs anything." She looked at him for a long moment, assessing, measuring, doing the desperate calculus of a woman who had probably stopped trusting men the hard way. Then slowly, she pulled the top edge of the bundle back. The baby was wrapped in what looked like pieces of her own dress layered over a flour sack, and he was so small he barely seemed real. His face was pale, too pale, and his lips had a faint blue tinge that tightened Samuel's jaw. But his little chest was moving, up and down, up and down. "He needs warming," Samuel said. "Now, not in 10 minutes." "I know that." "Then come here. Sit by the fire." He stood and moved back to give her room. "I'll put on water for something hot." She didn't move immediately. She was watching him with that measuring look, and he could see her thinking, could see the war in her expression between the desperation of the situation and whatever had happened to her to make trust feel like surrender. "I'm not going to ask you any questions tonight," Samuel said. He went to the hook by the door and took down a blanket, his good wool one, the one he'd traded 2 beaver pelts for in Harlan Creek, and held it out to her. "Whatever brought you up here in a blizzard with a newborn can keep till morning. Right now there's just the fire and the water and getting that baby warm. Everything else waits." She stared at the blanket. Then she stood across the cabin and sat down beside the fire. Samuel made coffee the real thing, not the chicory substitute, and he warmed some of the salt pork and the last of a tin of peaches he'd been saving. She didn't ask for food. She ate every bite of it anyway, one-handed, keeping the other arm around the baby, who she'd unwrapped enough to let the fire's warmth reach him. The color in the infant's lips slowly shifted from blue to pink. It took the better part of an hour. Samuel didn't watch her. He sat in the other chair with his coffee, and he stared at the fire, and he gave her the only thing he had to give. Right then, the dignity of not being studied. But she spoke first. "My name is Clara Whitmore." "Samuel Carter." "I know who you are." He looked at her, then surprised, and she almost managed something that might have been a small, exhausted smile. "People in the valley talk about the man on the North Mountain. They say you used to be cavalry, used to be a lot of things. They say you don't come down much." "No, ma'am." "I was hoping you wouldn't." She looked down at the baby, smoothed a piece of the flour sack across his chest. "I was hoping this cabin would be empty. I just needed somewhere out of the storm." "Well," Samuel looked back at the fire. "It ain't empty, but you're welcome to it tonight." Silence settled between them, but it was a different kind of silence than the one Samuel lived in normally. That one was empty. This one had weight to it, had people in it even when nobody was talking. He should have left it there. Let her sleep. Let the storm pass, and in the morning point her toward whatever she was running to. But the firelight shifted, and it caught the edge of her collar where her coat had slipped, and what Samuel saw made his hand stop halfway to his coffee cup. A scar. Not a scar from a fall or a kitchen burn or a childhood scrape. This scar was deliberate. It was a mark, letters burned into skin below her left shoulder, and even partially obscured by the torn edge of her dress, he could see enough of it to understand what it was. Someone had branded her. Samuel's jaw set so hard his back teeth ached. He didn't say anything. He looked back at the fire. But his hand, when he picked up the coffee cup, wasn't entirely steady. She'd seen him look. He knew that. And when she pulled the coat edge back up to cover it, she didn't apologize, and she didn't explain. She just did it with that same straight-backed dignity, and then looked at the fire herself and said nothing. Samuel Carter had been alone on his mountain for 4 years because the world below was full of things he didn't want to think about anymore. He had lost a wife to a fever. He had lost 2 good men under his command to orders that should never have been given. He had watched a town strip a man of his land through a courthouse full of lies and call it justice. He had decided somewhere in the wreckage of all that the best thing he could do was remove himself from a world he could not fix and could not bear to watch break. But he was looking at a mark burned into a woman's shoulder like she was livestock. And the thing that had shifted in his chest an hour ago shifted again harder this time, and it had a name now. Rage. Not the hot explosive kind, the cold kind, the kind that doesn't flare and die, the kind that settles in and stays. "Clara," he said. "Yes." "You don't have to tell me anything tonight." He kept his eyes on the fire. "But in the morning, if you want to, I'll listen." She didn't answer right away. The baby made a small sound, the first sound he'd made since Samuel came in a tiny fussing noise that wasn't quite a cry, and she shifted him in her arms and murmured something too low to hear. "His name is Thomas," she said finally. "I named him for my father. My father was a good man." A beat. "There aren't as many of those as people say." "No," Samuel agreed. "There aren't." Another silence. The storm howled outside, and the fire popped, and the cabin held them against the cold, and Samuel thought about the scar, and the broken pistol, and the 6-week-old baby wrapped in pieces of a dress, and he thought about a man somewhere in the valley below who had done this, and was probably still down there right now, warm and well-fed, and certain that what he owned could not leave him. "Get some sleep," Samuel said. "You can have the bunk. I'll take the chair." "I can't take your bed." "You're not taking it. I'm lending it." He stood, picked up his rifle from beside the door, and moved the chair so it faced the entrance. "And I sleep light." She looked at him. Really looked at him the way she'd been carefully not doing all evening, the way you look at something you're afraid might disappear if you examine it too closely. "Why?" she asked. "You don't know me. You don't know anything about what I've done, or what I'm running from, or who's going to come looking." Samuel sat down in the chair and settled the rifle across his knees. "No," he said. "I don't." Then why? He thought about his wife. He thought about two soldiers who followed his orders into a ravine. He thought about a man stripped of his land by a courthouse full of liars. He thought about all the times he had been too far away, or too powerless, or too late. "Because I'm here," he said simply. "And right now that's enough of a reason." Clara Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. Then she carried Thomas to the bunk, lay down with the baby against her chest, and pulled the wool blanket up over them both. She was asleep inside of 10 minutes. Samuel sat in his chair with his rifle across his knees and listened to the storm and watched the door, and he did not sleep at all. Because somewhere in the telling of those 10 minutes of silence, in the way she'd eaten the food without pride, and held the baby with that fierce, quiet tenderness, and covered the scar without a word of shame. Somewhere in all of that, Clara Whitmore had done something to Samuel Carter that the last 4 years of deliberate solitude had kept anyone from doing. She'd made him want to know her story, and Samuel Carter, who had removed himself from a world full of things he couldn't fix, felt the cold, hard truth of his situation settle over him, like the snow settling on the mountain outside. He already knew whose name was in that brand, because there was only one man in the valley who thought that way: William Blackthorne. And William Blackthorne was not the kind of man who let things he considered his property simply walk away. Samuel looked at the door, at the storm beyond it, at the particular darkness of a Montana winter night that would slow any rider but not stop a determined one. He adjusted the rifle on his knees, and he sat, and he waited for morning, knowing that by morning everything about his quiet mountain life would be different, because he had opened a door in a blizzard and seen a scar, and a man like Samuel Carter, whatever else he'd become in 4 years of chosen exile, was not the kind of man who looked away. He never had been. That was, if he was honest with himself, exactly why he'd come up the mountain in the first place. Not to escape the world, but to escape knowing he couldn't save it. He looked at the woman sleeping across the cabin with her baby pressed to her heart. Maybe some quiet part of him thought you don't have to save the whole world. Maybe just this corner of it. Maybe just tonight. The storm raged on. The fire burned low, and then he fed it again, and it burned low again, and he fed it again. Outside, somewhere far down the mountain, a wolf called once and went silent. Thomas made that small fussing sound again around 3 in the morning. Clara woke instantly, the way mothers wake, the way people wake, who have been sleeping with one ear open for danger for a very long time. And she sat up and held him and rocked him gently in the firelight and sang something under her breath, a half melody. Samuel didn't recognize low and wordless and aching. He pretended not to hear it. But it was the most human sound this cabin had held in 4 years. And Samuel Carter, sitting in his chair with his rifle and his cold rage and his 4-year-old reasons for being alone, felt something in the locked room of his chest that he hadn't felt in so long he'd nearly forgotten it had a name. He felt it, and he didn't look away from the door, and he didn't say anything, and he didn't let on. But he felt it, and by morning, when the storm had dropped to a whisper, and the first gray light was coming through the cracks in the shutter, and Clara Whitmore woke and sat up and looked across the cabin at him, with those direct, measuring eyes, he knew that whatever came down that mountain after her, he was not moving out of the way. Some decisions don't feel like decisions. They feel like something you'd already made a long time ago in a different place before you knew what you were deciding for. Samuel Carter had decided a long time ago that he was done. Done fighting for things he couldn't hold on to. Done standing up in a world that knocked everything back down. Done caring about anything enough to lose it. But he looked at Clara Whitmore in the gray morning light, and at the baby sleeping in the wool blanket he'd traded 2 beaver pelts for, and at the scar she hadn't bothered to cover this morning, because there was no point in hiding it from a man who'd already seen it. And he thought, well, I reckon I lied. She woke before Samuel moved from his chair, sat up with Thomas already in her arms like she'd been holding him even in sleep, and the first thing she did was look at the door. Not at Samuel. The door. checking it the way a person checks something they've been afraid of their whole night. Samuel watched her do it and didn't say anything. "Storm's dropped," he said finally. "I know." She'd already heard it, the absence of the wind more than any sound. "I need to go." "Where?" She didn't answer that right away. She stood shifting Thomas to her left arm with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing it for 6 weeks and had figured out all the angles, and she looked around the cabin in that measuring way she had, cataloging, assessing, doing the math on her situation the way someone does when they've had to do that math so many times it's become reflex. "Clara." Samuel set the rifle against the wall and stood. "Where were you planning to go?" "North," she said. "There's a settlement, Millerton, about 40 miles up. I have a cousin there. She doesn't know I'm coming, but she'll take us in." A beat. "I think she'll take us in." 40 miles, Samuel said. "In January, with a 6-week-old baby." "I'm aware of the distance." "You got a horse." She looked at him. That was her answer. Samuel crossed to the stove and put the coffee on, and didn't say anything for a moment because he was doing his own math, and he didn't particularly like where it was coming out. 40 miles north was 2 days of hard riding in good conditions. In January, after a fresh snow on foot, with an infant, that wasn't a journey. That was a death sentence dressed up as a plan. "Sit down," he said. "Eat something. Then we'll talk about what makes sense." "I don't need you to tell me what makes sense. I know you don't." He pulled the salt pork from the hook and set it on the stove. "I'm going to tell you anyway." She sat. Not because he said to, he understood that clearly from the look she gave him. She sat because Thomas had started fussing, and she needed both hands free to settle him, and sitting was easier. But she watched Samuel with those direct eyes while he cooked, and after a while she said, "How do you know William Blackthorne?" Samuel's hand didn't stop moving, but something in his shoulders changed, just slightly. "Didn't say I did." "You went still last night," she said. "When you saw the mark, you knew whose it was before I said a word." He put the salt pork in the pan and listened to it start to sizzle. "Valley's not that big," he said. "Man like Blackthorne makes himself known. A man like Blackthorne." Clara repeated, and there was something in her voice, not bitterness exactly, something older than bitterness. "Makes himself known because he wants to be known, because being known is how he controls people. They're supposed to hear the name and stop asking questions." She paused. "Did it work on you?" Samuel turned and looked at her. "Does it look like it?" Something shifted in her expression. Not quite trust, not yet, but the first fractional movement toward it, like a door that's been jammed for a long time, hearing the right knock. "He came to my mother's house when I was 17, she said. It wasn't preamble, she started the way people start when they've decided to say a thing and want to get through it before they lose the nerve. She owed money, back taxes on a piece of land my father left her. Blackthorne paid the debt. Said she could work it off through the ranch." A pause. "She thought she was saving the house. She didn't understand what the arrangement actually was." Samuel turned back to the stove. "How long? 7 years?" She said it flat, the way you say a number you've looked at so long, it stopped having edges. "My mother died 4 years in. After that, it was just me." She looked down at Thomas. "And then Thomas." Samuel pulled the pan off the heat. He stood there for a second with his back to her. "The brand," he said quietly. "That was him. That was his foreman," she said. "Mr. Holt. Blackthorne didn't dirty his hands. He just gave the order." A beat. "He said it was so everyone would know I was his, that if I ran they'd bring me back." She looked at the door again. "He wasn't wrong about the first part. The moment I crossed into Harlan Creek, the sheriff's deputy spotted it and turned me around." "When was that?" 4 days ago." Samuel turned around. "You've been out in this for 4 days. 3 days, then the storm hit and I found your cabin." She looked up at him, and there was something fierce in her expression, something that wasn't asking for sympathy and wasn't going to accept it if he offered it. "I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you so you understand the situation you're already in. because you're in it now whether you decided to be or not. They'll have tracked me here by now, or they will once the snow clears. And when they come, they can come, Samuel said. Clara stopped. He set a plate down in front of her and sat down across the table and looked at her directly. Let me be clear about something, Clara. I don't have anything left in this world that Blackthorn can threaten. He can't take my land, it's not worth taking. He can't take my reputation, I threw that away myself. He can't take my livelihood. A pause. The things I cared about losing are already gone. That makes me a particular kind of free. She stared at him. That's either the bravest thing I've ever heard or the most reckless. Probably both, Samuel said. Eat. She ate. Thomas settled into the drowsy, milk-drunk sleep of a newborn and lay against her arm like a small, warm stone. And outside the snow sparkled in the first real sunlight Montana had shown in a week. And in the cabin, Samuel watched Clara Whitmore eat salt pork and hardtack and drink black coffee without complaint. And he thought about William Blackthorn. He'd seen the man exactly once. 2 years back in the yard of the Harlan Creek courthouse watching his lawyer argue a property claim against a Nestor family named Pruitt. The Pruitts had 3 daughters and a milk cow, and a deed that was as legitimate as any deed in the territory. Blackthorn had stood in the courthouse yard in a good coat with clean boots and watched the proceedings through the window with the particular expression of a man who already knows how it ends. The Pruitts lost. The lawyer had produced documents that Samuel, even at a distance, could tell were wrong in some way he couldn't quite name. The paper too new, the ink too uniform. He'd thought about it for weeks afterward. Then he'd stopped thinking about it because thinking about it didn't change anything, and not thinking about it was easier. He thought about it now. How many men does he run? Samuel asked. Clara looked up. At the ranch, 12, maybe 14, but the ones he uses for things like this, there's 4 of them. Holt runs them. She paused. Holt is the one you have to worry about. The others follow whoever they're paid to follow. Holt follows Blackthorn because he believes in him. That's different. How so? A man who follows money will stop when the money runs out, or the risk gets too high, she said. A man who believes won't stop. Ever. She said it with the authority of someone who had watched Holt for 7 years and had no illusions left about what he was. Samuel nodded slowly. That tracked with what he knew about that particular type of man. Has Holt ever been north of the valley? He knows these mountains, Clara said. He grew up trapping up here before Blackthorn hired him. That's actually why I went the way I did through the high pass. I thought it might be the one place he'd expect me not to go. She paused. I thought the storm would help. It did, Samuel said. It bought you time, but it's done now. He looked at the shutter. By noon the sky'll be clear and the sun'll be on the snow, and anybody who knows how to read a trail is going to be able to follow you right to my door. Clara's jaw tightened. Then I need to go before noon. You need to think before you do anything. He leaned forward. 40 miles north on foot with an infant is not a plan. What it is Holt finding you in the open with no shelter and no help and nowhere to go. At least here there's walls. At least here there's... You, she said. Yes, he said simply. Me. She looked at him for a long moment. Thomas made a small sound in his sleep, and her arm tightened around him automatically, and Samuel watched that gesture, that reflex, that instant, fierce protectiveness that she couldn't turn off even when she was calculating survival odds, and something in his chest did that thing again, that shifting thing. Why? She asked. And it was the same question she'd asked last night, the same word. But it meant something different now in the daylight. Last night, it had been wariness. Now it was something more like genuine bewilderment. You don't know me. You laid out a perfectly reasonable life for yourself up here on this mountain, and I walked into it, and now there are 4 men, dangerous men, who are going to come to your door. Why would you... Clara. He said her name quietly, and she stopped. I spent 4 years asking myself whether anything I did mattered. whether there was any point in being the kind of man I used to think I was. He picked up his coffee cup. You walked into my cabin in a blizzard with a baby and a broken gun and a mark on your shoulder that somebody put there to make sure you'd never forget you weren't free. He took a drink. I reckon the answer to my question just walked through my door. She was quiet for a very long time. Thomas made his small sound again. He's going to be hungry soon, she said. I know. You don't have anything. I have 2 good goats in the lean-to, Samuel said. Milk's milk. Clara looked at him. Then she looked down at Thomas. Then she pressed her lips together in a way that Samuel was beginning to understand meant she was managing something, keeping something contained that would take too much energy to let out right now. All right, she said. All right? All right, she said again, and this time her chin came up slightly. But I want to know your plan. Not your instinct. Your plan. Because instinct in a situation like this gets people killed, and I have not kept this baby alive for 6 weeks in order to lose him, because someone led with their heart instead of their head. Samuel almost smiled. Not quite, the muscles for it were too rusty, but almost. Fair point, he said. Here's what I know. Holt's going to come up the north slope because that's the logical trail from the valley. I've got 2 ways off this mountain that he doesn't know about: an eastern switchback that drops down into the Ridley Creek watershed and a game trail that goes west through the high timber to the old Mission Road. Neither of those is on any map. He knows this mountain, Clara said. You said he trapped up here. He knows the main trails, Samuel said. The switchback and the game trail, I cut those myself over 4 years of walking the same ground twice a day. They don't look like trails from the outside. You have to know where to step. He paused. But here's the problem. I can get you off this mountain. I can get you north, get you to Millerton. But that doesn't solve anything. Clara's eyes sharpened. What do you mean? I mean, Blackthorn isn't going to stop because you made it to your cousin's house, Samuel said. Holt is going to keep looking until he finds you, or until Blackthorn tells him to stop. And Blackthorn isn't going to tell him to stop. You know why? Because it's not about me, she said quietly. It's about the fact that I left. It's about the fact that you left and you're still alive, Samuel said. You're proof that it can be done, and a man like Blackthorn can't have proof like that walking around. Clara's face went very still. Samuel knew she understood this. He could see from her expression that she'd understood it before he said it. She'd been living with this understanding for 4 days, carrying it along with Thomas and the broken pistol and the 40-mile distance to Millerton. So what are you saying? She asked. I'm saying running north buys time, Samuel said. It doesn't buy safety. He set his cup down. If you want safety, real safety, the kind that lasts, you need something that stops Blackthorn entirely. Not just slows him down. And what stops a man like William Blackthorn entirely? Samuel looked at her. The truth, he said. In the right place at the right time with the right people watching. Clara stared at him. The courthouse in Harlan Creek is owned by Blackthorn's money. The sheriff is owned by Blackthorn's money. The newspaper in town is owned by his brother-in-law, Samuel said. I know. Then what truth delivered where to whom? Not Harlan Creek, Samuel said. Helena. She went quiet. There's a federal circuit judge, Samuel said. Judge Ambrose Carey. He rides the territory 3 times a year. He'll be in Helena by the end of February. He isn't Blackthorn's. He can't be bought. I know this because 2 years ago, he turned down a bribe from a man twice as wealthy as Blackthorn and published the attempt in the Federal Record. Samuel leaned forward. And I know something else. That property claim Blackthorn pushed through against the Pruitt family 2 years back, the documents his lawyer produced were fraudulent. I saw it. I can't prove it from here, but I know what I saw. Clara was looking at him with a different kind of attention now, sharper. How do you know about the Pruitts? Because I should have done something about it then, and I didn't, Samuel said, and the flatness of his voice carried more weight than anger would have. I watched it happen, and I told myself it wasn't my business, and I came back up the mountain, and I thought about it for 6 months, and then I stopped thinking about it." He looked at the table. There were other claims before the Pruitts. There are going to be others after. Blackthorn's been building this territory by territory through fraudulent deeds and bought courts, and nobody's put the whole picture together yet because nobody's been in a position to see all the pieces. Clara was quiet for a long moment. The fire popped. Thomas stirred and settled. "I have papers," she said. Samuel looked up. 7 years, she said. "I kept everything, every order Blackthorn put in writing, every contract he made the workers sign, the original deed agreements from the families whose land he took." She looked directly at Samuel. "I can read and write." He never thought to worry about that. He didn't think servants were educated enough to understand what they were looking at. A pause. He was wrong about that. Samuel stared at her. "Where are these papers? Sewn into the lining of the coat I came in with." Samuel stared at her for another moment. Then he stood up, went to the hook by the door where he'd hung her coat to dry overnight, and brought it to the table and set it down in front of her, without a word. Clara looked at it. Then she looked at Samuel. Then she reached for it and turned it over, found the seam she'd stitched herself along the inside hem, and pulled it loose with 3 sharp tugs that said she'd done this kind of hiding before. The papers she drew out were folded small and wrapped in oilskin, and they were slightly damp at the edges, but intact. She spread them on the table between them. Samuel didn't touch them. He bent over them and read in silence for what felt like a long time, and the only sound in the cabin was the fire, and Thomas's small breathing, and the occasional distant drip of snow melting off the eaves in the strengthening sun. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said. "This is—" He stopped, started again. "This is enough. This is more than enough if we can get it to Helena. If we can get it in front of Carrie." He straightened. "This isn't just Blackthorn and your situation. This is a pattern. He's been filing these claims for 15 years. The same lawyer, the same witnesses, the same notary." He looked at her. "Do you know what this means?" "It means he goes to prison," Clara said. "Or it means Holt finds us on the road to Helena and we don't arrive." She folded her hands on the table. "So the question is how?" And that was where they were bent over papers on a table in a mountain cabin with the sun strengthening outside and the clock running when Gideon screamed. Not whinnied. Screamed the high, sharp, cut-off sound a horse makes when something has frightened it badly. It came from the lean-to, sudden and violent, and it brought Samuel out of his chair before he'd finished the thought rifle in hand, moving to the shutter and pressing his back to the wall beside it. "Clara, get in the corner. Get down." She was already moving. She had Thomas against her chest, and she was behind the stove. The stove, the heaviest iron object in the room, before Samuel had the shutter cracked a half-inch. He put his eye to the gap. A rider at the tree line, one rider sitting still, and he was just sitting there, watching the cabin, not moving, not calling out, not approaching, just sitting in the shadows of the pine brake at the edge of the clearing with the sun behind him. So Samuel couldn't make out the face, only the shape of a big man on a big horse who had positioned himself very deliberately where the light would make him impossible to read. "How many?" Clara said. Her voice was low and controlled and completely chillingly calm. "One visible," Samuel said, "which means there's more I can't see." "Holt," she said. Not a question. "Maybe." Samuel kept his eye on the tree line. The rider hadn't moved. "This is how he likes to work," Clara said, and her voice was still that eerie calm. "He'll sit there. Let you know he sees you. Let you feel it." She shifted Thomas. "Then he'll send someone around the back." Samuel moved fast, crossed to the rear of the cabin, pressed to the back wall beside the single rear window. He cracked the shutter. A second rider, coming around the eastern side of the cabin slow, making no effort to hide. They wanted to be seen. They wanted Samuel and Clara to know they were surrounded before they knew how badly. "Two," Samuel said. "One front, one rear." He came back to the center of the room, moving quickly and quietly. "Loft," he said to Clara. "There's a loft above the stove. The ladder, can you climb it with Thomas?" "Tell me where the ladder is," she said, and there was no hesitation in it, no wavering, nothing that suggested she was anything other than a woman running the numbers as fast as he was. He got her up. Thomas didn't make a sound. He'd dropped back into deep sleep with the confidence of an infant who knew nothing yet about the specific kind of fear currently occupying the people who loved him. Clara settled into the low space of the loft with the baby and the oilskin-wrapped papers she hadn't let go of, and Samuel pulled the ladder up after her and moved back to his position by the front shutter. The rider at the tree line moved. He walked his horse out of the shadow of the pines and into the open clearing, slow and deliberate, and now Samuel could see him clearly. Big man, wide-shouldered, hard face below a flat-brimmed hat, the kind of face that had made peace with doing whatever it was told to do and charged extra for enjoying it. He stopped 30 feet from the cabin door. "Carter?" he said. The voice carried easily through the shutter. Deep, unhurried, the voice of a man who'd never once needed to shout. "Name's Holt. I work for William Blackthorne. I believe you've got something that belongs to Mr. Blackthorne inside that cabin." Samuel didn't answer. "I know she's in there," Holt said. "We tracked her from the South Pass. Good snow for tracking." A pause. "Now I'm going to ask you to do something sensible, Carter. Open that door, send the woman out with the child, and we ride back down the mountain, and this whole thing ends here. You don't get hurt. Nobody gets hurt." Samuel looked at the rifle in his hands. He looked at the front door. He thought about Clara in the loft above him, Thomas asleep against her chest, the oilskin papers folded in her grip. He thought about the Pruitt family. He thought about 7 years. He thought about a brand pressed into a shoulder. "Holt!" he said, loud enough to carry. "I'm going to say this once. There's nobody in this cabin that belongs to William Blackthorne. There never was. You turn your men around and ride back down, and I'll give you my word that I'll forget you were ever here." A pause. Then Holt said almost conversationally, "You're going to give me your word." "That's what I said." Another pause. Longer. "That's a real interesting offer, Carter." Samuel could hear the weight of a decision being turned over behind those words. Real interesting. Problem is, Mr. Blackthorne's going to want an answer I can actually give him. And the mountain man asked us to leave isn't an answer he's going to find satisfying. "Tell him," Samuel said, "that what he's looking for doesn't exist anymore." Silence. "What's that supposed to mean?" Holt said. "It means you should go," Samuel said, "while going is still an option." The silence stretched long enough to be its own kind of statement. Samuel kept his eye to the shutter crack, watching Holt, watching the way the man sat his horse with that absolute stillness that wasn't patience, but was something else, a coiled quality, a readiness. And he knew, with the certainty of a man who'd spent 15 years reading other men in dangerous situations, that Holt was making a calculation, not whether to push. When? A sound from above. Thomas. Not a cry, not loud enough to be a cry yet, but the warning sounds that came before one, the small escalating complaints of a baby who had slept long enough and was announcing his requirements to the world with the democratic force of an infant who understood nothing about timing. Holt's head came up. He'd heard it. Samuel watched Holt's face change. Not much, not a dramatic shift, just a subtle reorganization of the certainty there. A confirmation of something he'd suspected. He turned his horse back toward the tree line, said something low to the second rider, who had appeared at the corner of the cabin, and then looked back at the front door one more time. "We'll be close," Holt said. "You think on it, Carter." Then he rode back into the pines. The second rider followed. Samuel stood at the shutter and watched the tree line for a full 5 minutes. Nothing moved. "Samuel." Clara's voice from the loft. Quiet, steady. "They're not gone," he said. "They're waiting." "I know." A pause. "Thomas is going to cry for real in about 2 minutes." "I know." "We need to move." "I know." He turned from the shutter. He looked at the rear wall of the cabin, at the particular section of floor beside his bunk, and then he moved the bunk aside and bent down and lifted the trapdoor in the floor that he'd cut the second year on the mountain for exactly this kind of situation. Not because he'd expected Holt specifically, but because Samuel Carter was the kind of man who cut trapdoors. Just in case. "There's a root cellar," he said. "It opens to a crawl space that connects to the back of the lean-to. We can get to the horses without crossing open ground." He looked up at the loft. "Can you manage the ladder one-handed?" Clara looked down at him. Thomas was making sounds of serious intent, now his small face working toward a complaint that was about to stop being quiet about it. "Watch me," she said, and she came down that ladder with Thomas in one arm and the oilskin papers tucked inside her coat, and her jaw set in the particular expression that Samuel was coming to understand was her version of a battle flag, and the sight of it, the sheer unbowed will of it, hit him somewhere below the sternum, like a physical thing. He caught the ladder at the bottom to steady it. She stepped off the last rung and looked at him from a distance of about 2 feet, close enough that he could see the exhaustion she was running on pure grit through, and the calculation still going behind her eyes, the constant running of the numbers. "The papers," she said. "If we make it to Helena, if we actually make it, is there a way to ensure they go before Carrie? Not through the local clerk. Not through anyone Blackthorne can reach first." "There's a man in Helena," Samuel said. "Federal marshal named Torrance. He's straight. I'd stake my life on it." "You're going to be staking mine," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once the way someone nods when they've made a decision they intend to keep and said, "Then let's go." Thomas, with extraordinary timing, chose that moment to stop threatening to cry and simply do it, a clear, carrying, indignant announcement of existence that bounced off the cabin walls and said everything about the fragility of their situation and nothing at all about how much it mattered. Samuel grabbed his ammunition, his bedroll, and the extra coat from the hook by the door. He lifted the trapdoor. He did not look back at the cabin, at the 4 years of quiet and the chair by the fire and the 11-day stretches of silence that had until last night felt like peace. He looked at Clara and at Thomas crying in her arms, and at the papers pressed against her heart, and he went through the trapdoor into the dark. The root cellar smelled like cold earth and dried herbs, and the particular darkness of a place that had never been meant for people, only for potatoes and salt pork and the things a man stored against a long winter. Samuel moved through it fast, one hand on the low ceiling to keep from cracking his head, and he could hear Clara behind him, her breathing controlled, deliberate. Thomas's cries muffled now, because she'd shifted him against her shoulder and was pressing her palm gently to the back of his head, the way a mother does when she needs quiet and can't ask for it out loud. The crawl space was 4 feet high and 12 feet long, and it opened through a wooden panel into the back corner of the lean-to, behind a stack of hay bales Samuel had positioned there the second year on the mountain, not quite knowing why, the way a man sometimes does things that only make sense later. He eased the panel open an inch. Listened. Gideon was breathing hard, shifting his weight, still spooked from whatever Holt's approach had done to him. The second horse, a gray mare Samuel kept for pack work, was pressed against the far wall of the lean-to, ears flat. No other sounds, no boots in the dirt, no voices. Samuel came through the panel and straightened and moved to Gideon, immediately putting a hand on the horse's neck and talking to him in the low, wordless way that worked better than any specific words. Gideon pushed his nose against Samuel's chest and blew out a long breath. "Easy," Samuel said. "Easy now." Clara came through behind him, Thomas still against her shoulder, and she looked at the horses and then at Samuel and said very quietly, "How long do we have?" "Not long," Samuel said. "Holt's patient, but he's not going to wait all day. Once he figures out we're not coming out the front door on our own, he'll come in." "Which direction do we ride?" "East." He was already saddling Gideon, hands moving fast through the familiar routine. "The switchback I told you about. It's narrow and it's steep, and it's going to be rough going with the fresh snow, but it drops us below the tree line fast and keeps us out of sight." He glanced at her. "You ride." "Some," she said. "The gray's steady," he said. "She won't spook. You'll be all right." "I'm not worried about me," Clara said, looking at Thomas. "Keep him inside your coat. Samuel said. "Hold him against your chest, not the saddle. Your body'll keep him warm, and he won't feel the motion as bad." He pulled the cinch tight, moved to the gray, and started her saddle. "It's going to be cold, and it's going to be fast, and I need you to tell me the second your arms give out. Not when you think they might give out. The second they do." "They won't." "Clara." "They won't," she said again. And this time the steadiness of it wasn't stubbornness. It was information. She was telling him something real about herself, something she'd measured and knew. He believed her. He got both horses ready in 4 minutes. He took down the extra blanket from the hook by the hay rack, doubled it, and helped her rig it as a sling inside her coat. So Thomas was held against her chest, with his head tucked below her chin. The baby had stopped crying. He was looking up at his mother with the wide, unfocused gaze of a newborn who was trying to understand a world that kept changing without explanation. And Clara looked down at him for exactly 1 second, with an expression that had no word for it. Something that was love and fear and ferocity, all braided together so tightly you couldn't pull one thread without unraveling the others. Then she looked up at Samuel and said, "Ready." They went out the lean-to door at a walk which was harder than going fast, but smarter. A fast exit would kick up noise and the sound would carry to the tree line. Samuel kept Gideon between the lean-to and the eastern tree line, using the cabin itself as cover from the front clearing, moving along the wall, and then into the first break of pines before he let himself breathe properly. He looked back once. The front clearing was empty. The tree line where Holt had positioned himself was still and quiet. Too quiet. "He's moving," Samuel said. "How do you know?" "Because if he was still watching, he'd let us see him," Samuel said. "He stopped wanting us to know where he is." He pushed Gideon to a trot, and Clara brought the gray alongside him without being told, and they went into the trees. The switchback trail was everything Samuel had promised, narrow, steep, carved into the mountain by 4 years of his own boots on the same ground, until the snow and the scrub grass had given up and accepted that this was a path now. Under a foot of fresh snow, it was barely visible at all, which was the point. Samuel rode it by memory, and knowing where to angle Gideon's shoulders at each turn, knowing where the ledge went soft on the left side, and where a rider could push the pace a little, and where they absolutely could not. Clara rode the gray right behind him. She didn't ask questions. She matched his pace and his angles, and she kept her weight back on the descents, the way someone who has ridden enough to understand the physics of it does without thinking. And Samuel found himself noting this with a kind of grim appreciation. They were 20 minutes down the switchback when the first shot was fired. It wasn't close. It came from above them, and to the north from the direction of the cabin, and it wasn't aimed at them. It was a signal shot, sharp and flat in the cold air, and Samuel knew immediately what it meant. Holt had found the root cellar. "They know we're gone," he said. "Can they follow this trail?" "So, they'll look for tracks," Samuel said. "The snow's working for us. We're not cutting as deep as horses would in softer ground. But Holt knows these mountains. He'll figure the direction." He pushed Gideon harder. "We need the creek bottom. Once we hit the Ridley Creek wash, the water'll cover our tracks and give us options." "How far?" 20 minutes if we push." "Push," she said. He pushed. The descent was brutal in the way that fast mountain riding in deep snow is always brutal. All sudden weight shifts and short lurching drops, and the constant low-level terror of a horse finding no purchase and going down. Gideon was sure-footed as a mountain goat, but even sure-footed horses had limits, and Samuel rode the edge of those limits all the way down the switchback with his jaw set and his hands light on the reins and his whole attention on the ground in front of him. Clara never made a sound behind him. Not once. He glanced back at the first sharp turn, and she was right there, Gray's head low and working. Clara's body moving with the horse in that easy, unconscious way, one hand on the reins and the other arm wrapped across her chest where Thomas was, her eyes on Samuel's back. He turned forward again and didn't look back after that. He didn't need to. They hit the Ridley Creek wash at the bottom, and Samuel turned Gideon south along the bank, keeping the horse in the shallows where the water ran thin and clear over gravel and would erase their prints. The cold of it soaked through his boots immediately, and he knew it was doing the same to Clara, but she didn't say anything, and he didn't mention it. "There's a trapper's station," he said, keeping his voice low. "Another 6 miles south along the creek. Man named Winslow runs it. He trades with me sometimes. He's got no love for Blackthorn. Blackthorn tried to buy him out 2 years ago, and Winslow told him in very specific terms what he could do with his money." A pause. "We can stop there, rest the horses, figure the next move." "Does Holt know about Winslow?" "Probably," Samuel said. "But Winslow is the kind of man Holt knows better than to push without a direct order. He's got friends up and down this creek, and he knows exactly who in this territory doesn't work for Blackthorn." He paused. "That's actually worth something. How far is Helena from the trapper's station?" 2.5 days hard riding," Samuel said. "Maybe 3 with Thomas." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "We need to move faster than 3 days." "I know. Holt won't stop." "I know that too." Another silence. Nothing but the sound of hooves in shallow water and the distant murmur of the creek running under thin ice at the edges, and the wind that had come up from the north again, carrying the particular sharpness that said the temperature was dropping as the day went on. "Samuel," Clara said. He looked back. She was looking at him steadily from the back of the gray Thomas's small head, visible just above her coat collar, her face pale from cold and exertion, but her eyes completely clear. "I need you to understand something," she said. "If it comes to a point where getting Thomas out is the only option, if there's a choice between the 2 of us getting through and just him getting through, I need you to take him." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. "That's not going to happen," he said. "I need you to say you understand." "Clara." "Say it," she said. And the way she said it, quiet, absolute, without any drama or plea in it. Just the plain iron weight of a mother laying down the most important instruction of her life, stopped any argument he might have made in its throat. Samuel held her gaze. "I understand," he said. She nodded. "Thank you." He turned back to the creek, and they rode south, and the cold deepened, and the mountains rose around them on both sides. And Samuel thought about what she'd just asked him, and what it had cost her to ask it. And he thought about what kind of person makes that calculation, that cleanly puts it out on the table, with no hesitation, no tears. Just here is the most important thing. Please don't waste it. The kind of person who'd survived 7 years by being exactly that clear-headed. The kind of person who kept records sewn into the lining of her coat. The kind of person who came down a ladder with a newborn in one arm because someone needed her to. Samuel had known a lot of strong people in his life. He'd known men who were hard as iron and didn't break under things that broke other men. He'd known soldiers who went forward when everyone around them was going back. He'd known his wife who had faced the fever with a kind of grace that he still didn't entirely have words for. But he had never known anyone quite like Clara Whitmore. And the thought of Holt's men being anywhere near her made the cold rage in his chest burn in a way that was almost warm. They reached Winslow's station just past midday. It was a low, long building that had started life as a single room and accumulated additions over 20 years until it looked like a series of afterthoughts connected by a common roof, and it smelled of wood smoke and cured hides, and the particular sourness of a place where men worked hard and bathed infrequently. Samuel tied the horses at the post and knocked twice on the door with the back of his knuckles. Not a polite knock, a specific rhythm that Winslow had established years ago as a way of knowing the difference between someone he wanted to see and someone he didn't. The door opened. Gus Winslow was 60 years old and built like he'd been assembled from spare parts that didn't quite match, too long in the arms, too short in the leg, a neck like a bull, and hands that could palm a man's head like a cantaloupe. He looked at Samuel, then at Clara, then at the shape of Thomas inside Clara's coat, and his expression went through several things in rapid succession before settling on something that looked like decision. "Get inside," he said, and stepped back from the door. The station's main room was warm, genuinely warm, the kind of warm that hits you in the face after cold riding and makes your fingers ache as the blood comes back. Samuel felt Clara release a breath behind him that she'd been holding for a long time. Winslow poured coffee without being asked and set it on the table, and then looked at Samuel with the direct, unhurried gaze of a man who'd been in enough serious situations to know that small talk was not the first requirement. "How bad?" he said. "Holt's behind us," Samuel said. "Maybe an hour, maybe less." Winslow's jaw moved, working something over. "How many?" "We saw 2, could be more." "It's 4, Clara said. Both men looked at her. "He always runs 4, she said. "He says it's the right number, enough to control a situation small enough to move fast." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "He's been Blackthorn's man for 11 years. He's good at what he does." Winslow looked at her for a moment. "You're Clara Whitmore," he said. Samuel went very still. Clara looked at the old trapper with an expression that didn't give anything away. "You know my name." "Know your situation," Winslow said. "Word came down the creek 3 days ago. Blackthorn put a notice out. Said you stole property and a sum of money from the ranch and he wants you returned." He looked at the shape of Thomas inside her coat. "Didn't mention the baby in the notice." "No," Clara said. "He wouldn't." "What's the truth?" "The truth," Clara said, "is in these papers." She pulled the oilskin package from inside her coat and set it on the table between them. 7 years of Blackthorn's operations. Fraudulent land claims, forced contracts, names of every official he's paid to look the other way. She looked at Winslow steadily. "I didn't take his money. I took my son and his evidence, and I intend to put both of them in front of a federal judge." Winslow looked at this package. He didn't touch it. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he recognizes as dangerous and is deciding whether the danger is the kind that goes away if you leave it alone, or the kind that comes for you regardless. Then he looked at Samuel. "You vouching for her?" "With everything I've got," Samuel said, which admittedly isn't much. Winslow almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way to his face, but it got close. "You always did have a talent for understatement, Carter." He picked up his own coffee. "Carrie's in Helena," he said. "Got word yesterday. He came in early. There's a land dispute case he's been asked to hear ahead of schedule. Something big." He looked at the oilskin package again. "If that package is what she says it is, and you can get it to Helena while Carrie's still there." "We know," Samuel said. "You've got a window," Winslow said. "Not a big one." "Then we need to ride today," Clara said. "We can't stay here overnight. If Holt comes here, and Winslow tells him he hasn't seen us—" "I'll tell him I haven't seen you," Winslow said, completely matter-of-fact. "He'll know you're lying. He'll suspect it," Winslow said. "That's different from knowing. And suspicion isn't enough to make a man like Holt do something stupid to a man with friends up and down this creek." He set his cup down. "You rest here 2 hours. Horses eat, you eat the baby." He looked at Thomas, and something unexpectedly gentle moved across the old trapper's face. "You do whatever a baby needs. Then you ride out the south end of the property. There's a road that joins the Helena track 12 miles on. It's not fast, but it's not a trail anyone outside this watershed knows about." Samuel looked at him. "Gus." "Don't," Winslow said, and the word was a complete sentence in itself, an entire conversation compressed into 4 letters, the way old men who have been friends for a long time talk to each other. "Don't thank me. Don't make it into something. Don't owe me." Samuel nodded. "All right." Clara had been watching this exchange with that quiet attention she brought to everything, and she looked at Winslow and said, "Thank you," in a way that was direct and specific, and not an apology for needing help. And Winslow looked at her and gave a short nod that respected the directness of it. They ate. Clara fed Thomas with the warmed goat's milk Samuel had thought to bring in the saddlebag, and the baby ate with the single-minded intensity of an infant who had strong opinions about priorities. And for a short while in Winslow's warm station, with food on the table, and the horses resting outside, and the immediate emergency. Paused. Just paused. Not gone. Samuel let himself think about Helena. About Judge Carey. About what those papers meant. and about what Blackthorn would do when he understood what was coming for him. He was still thinking about that when the door opened. Not Winslow's door. The man was in the back room doing something with the horses through the connecting wall. The front door. The one Samuel had come through. It opened, and a man stepped in, and for a half second, Samuel didn't recognize him. He was young, maybe 20, wearing Blackthorn's ranch colors, and carrying a rifle in the crook of his arm, with the self-conscious ease of someone who was trying to look more dangerous than he was. Not Holt, one of the others. "Ma'am." He was looking at Clara. His voice shook slightly, which meant he was young enough to still feel things, which was either helpful or dangerous, depending on which way it broke. "Ma'am, Mr. Holt sent me ahead. He wants you to know." Samuel was between him and Clara before the sentence was finished. Not fast, deliberate. He walked across the room and positioned himself between the young man and the table where Clara sat, and he kept his hands visible and his voice level, and he said, "Son, think about what you're doing." The young man's rifle came up an inch. Not all the way, just an inch. A reflex more than a decision. "Mr. Holt says." "I know what Holt says," Samuel said. "I'm asking what you say." The rifle stopped moving. The young man blinked. "You tracked us here," Samuel said. "You came through the door while your boss hung back, which means he sent you first." He let that sit for a second. "You know what that means. When a man sends someone else through a door first, it means he's not sure what's on the other side, and he's not willing to find out personally." The young man's face went through something complicated. "How old are you?" Samuel asked. 22. 22, Samuel said. "You got people. I got a mother in Billings. Your mother know you work for Blackthorn." The rifle came down another inch. The young man said nothing. "I'm going to tell you something," Samuel said, "and I need you to hear it. Not just listen to it. The woman at that table has papers that are going in front of a federal judge in Helena. Papers that document 15 years of what Blackthorn's been doing to people in this valley. When those papers get to that judge, and they are going to get there, I promise you that every man who works for William Blackthorn is going to have to answer for what they did and what they allowed." He kept his voice quiet, reasonable, like a man talking to someone he genuinely wanted to reach. "You're 22, and your mother's in Billings, and I don't know one thing about you except that you're here. But you still have a choice. Most of the men in this story don't." The room was absolutely silent. Clara hadn't moved from the table. Samuel knew without looking that she was watching, and he knew that Thomas was still and quiet, and he knew that somewhere behind the connecting wall, Winslow had stopped moving and was listening. The young man looked at Samuel. Then he looked past Samuel at Clara. Then he looked at the shape of Thomas under Clara's coat. "I didn't know about the baby," he said. "In the notice Blackthorn put out, it didn't say anything about a baby." "No," Clara said from the table. Her voice was completely calm. "It didn't." The young man stood there with his rifle half raised and his 22 years working on his face, like weather, and Samuel watched him, and waited, and did not move. "Holt's half a mile back," the young man said. "He told me to come in, see who was here, and come back out and tell him." A pause. "He didn't say what I had to tell him." Samuel looked at him. "Go out the door," the young man said. "South end of the property. Don't come back through the creek." He lowered the rifle. "I'll tell him you weren't here." Samuel said nothing for a moment. Then, "Your name." The young man's jaw tightened slightly, not resistance, more like someone bracing for something. "Eli," he said. "Eli Marsh." "Eli Marsh," Samuel said. "I'll remember that." Something moved in the young man's face. He looked at Clara one more time, at Thomas, and whatever he was seeing there settled something in him that Samuel had watched working loose from the moment he'd walked through the door. Then he turned and walked out the way he'd come in, and the door closed behind him, and the room was quiet. Clara said, "How long?" 5 minutes, Samuel said, already moving. "Maybe less. Even if he does what he said, Holt's going to wonder why he took so long and come check." "Then we go now." "We go now." He called back for Winslow, who appeared from the connecting room with the horses already resaddled. The old trapper had not apparently stopped preparing while he was listening. He had an extra bedroll tied to the gray's cantle and a saddlebag loaded with provisions that he handed to Samuel without a word. "South end of the property," Winslow said. "Road joins the Helena track 12 miles on. Keep moving. Gus. Carter." Winslow looked at him with those old eyes that had seen enough of the world to not need to say the things the world expected you to say. "Go." They went. The south road was rougher than the creek trail and colder, and the horses felt the push of 2 hours hard running in their gait. But they moved, and they kept moving, and Samuel kept Gideon at the edge of what the horse could hold without breaking down. And Clara rode the gray right behind him and didn't flag. They were 2 miles south of Winslow's when Samuel heard it. Hoofbeats. Behind them. Not one horse more. He looked back over his shoulder. Through the timber, still a distance back, but gaining riders. He couldn't count them from here, but he didn't need to. "They're coming," Clara said. She'd heard it too. "I know." Eli told him. "Maybe," Samuel said. "Or Holt figured it out himself. Doesn't matter now." "How far to where the road joins the Helena track?" 10 miles. "And if they catch us before that?" Samuel looked at the road ahead, at the tree cover on both sides, at the sky above, clear and cold, and offering no help. "They won't," he said. "Samuel, they won't," he said again, harder this time, and he pushed Gideon from a canter to a gallop and heard the gray come up behind him and felt the cold of the mountain air against his face, like a hand pushing back, and he thought about Carrie and Helena and the papers against Clara's chest and the 6-week-old baby riding in a sling through a Montana January while 4 men came fast through the trees behind them. He thought about what Clara had said at the creek. If it comes to a point where getting Thomas out is the only option. He pushed Gideon harder. The trees blurred on both sides. The hoofbeats behind them grew louder, and then suddenly, without warning, a figure came out of the trees directly ahead on the road and pulled a horse sideways across the trail and stopped. Samuel hauled Gideon back so hard the horse sat down on his haunches, and Clara's gray nearly drove into them from behind, and Samuel had his rifle up before Gideon had finished sliding, and then he stopped. Because the figure across the road was not Holt, it was Eli Marsh. He was sitting his horse across the middle of the Helena road with his rifle in his hand, and he was facing back the way Samuel and Clara had come, and he was not looking at them at all. He was looking at the riders in the trees behind them. "Go," Eli Marsh said without turning around. His voice was steady. 22 years old, and his voice was completely steady. "I'll slow them down." Samuel stared at him. "I said go," Eli said. "I didn't do this so you could sit here and watch." Clara was already moving. She had the gray past Samuel, and through the gap Eli had left on the left side of the road before Samuel had finished making his decision, and Samuel looked at Eli Marsh one more time, at the set of his shoulders, at the way he was sitting. His horse like a man who had just finished the calculation. Clara had taught Samuel to recognize the one where you put the most important thing on the table and commit to protecting it. "Eli," Samuel said. "Ride Carter," the young man said. Samuel rode. Behind him, he heard Holt's voice calling out, demanding the unhurried authority of it gone, now replaced with something harder. He heard Eli answer back. He couldn't make out the words, and after the first bend in the road, he couldn't hear anything but the hoofbeats of 2 horses running flat out on a frozen Montana road in January, running south toward a Helena track 12 miles on, and a federal judge and a set of papers that were going to change everything. He didn't look back. He rode. They rode until Gideon started to labor. Samuel felt it in the horse's breathing first, the rhythm changing the cadence, losing its clean evenness, and picking up a ragged edge that meant the animal was pulling from reserves instead of strength. He brought Gideon down to a trot and then a walk and looked back, and Clara was right there on the gray. Her face drawn tight with cold and effort, Thomas still against her chest, her eyes asking the question before her mouth did. "How far back?" she said. "Don't know." Samuel was listening to the road behind them. Nothing. No hoofbeats, no voices. No sounds that didn't belong to the wind and the trees. Eli bought us something. Don't know how much. Is he going to be all right? Samuel looked at her. It was an honest question. She wasn't asking for comfort, she was asking for his actual assessment, and she deserved one. Holt won't hurt him if he stands down, he said. He's Blackthorn's hired man, not a killer for sport. And Eli's not worth the trouble of making an example of if there's nobody to see it. He paused. He'll be scared, probably fired, but he'll be all right. Clara nodded, accepting this, filing it away. How far to the Helena track? 8 miles. And then we're on a road that other people use, Samuel said. Stage runs it twice a week, freight wagons. We're not alone on the Helena track, which means Holt has to be a lot more careful about what he does in front of witnesses. He glanced at her. It changes the math. Blackthorn has people in Helena, Clara said. Some. His lawyer Reeves keeps an office there. And there's a man named Carver who runs the land registry. Blackthorn pays him to delay filings and bury records. She said this the way she said everything, directly, without decoration, the facts laid out in the order they needed to be heard. If Reeves gets word we're coming before we reach Cary, then we don't let word get ahead of us, Samuel said. We ride straight to the federal marshal's office. Not the hotel, not a boarding house, not anywhere we'd be expected to stop. Straight to Torrance. He looked at her. You trust me on that? She held his gaze for a moment. The wind cut between them, and Thomas made a small sound beneath her coat, and she put her chin down briefly, checking him with that automatic maternal gravity. Yes, she said. They walked the horses another quarter mile to let them breathe, and then pushed back to a canter, and the miles went by in the grinding cold arithmetic of January riding. Counting time, not by landmarks, but by the feel of the horse under you, and the deepening ache in your hands, and the way the cold stops hurting after a while, and starts feeling like a fact of the world, like something that was always there and always will be. Samuel thought about Torrance. Marshal Denton Torrance had been a federal marshal for 14 years, appointed under the Grant administration, and somehow surviving every political shift since, through the simple expedient of doing the job so thoroughly and so without favor, that removing him would have required admitting publicly why you wanted him gone. Samuel had met him 3 years ago in circumstances that still gave him a complicated feeling. A situation involving a horse thief and a case of mistaken identity that had resolved itself without anyone going to prison, but had left Samuel with a very clear sense of who Torrance was. He was the kind of man who read documents carefully, who asked the same question 3 different ways and compared the answers, who didn't make a decision until he had to and didn't change it once he had. Clara's papers were going to the right man. That was what Samuel kept coming back to as they rode, the specific rightness of it, the way all the pieces of an impossible situation had aligned into something that might actually work if they could just get there. He didn't let himself think past that. He'd learned a long time ago that thinking past the immediate problem was how you got killed by it. You had to stay with the road in front of you and trust that the road went somewhere. The Helena track appeared ahead of them, wider and well-worn, the ruts of wagon wheels cutting clear lines through the snow, and Samuel felt something in his chest release slightly. Not relax, not yet, but release the way a held breath releases, even if you're not safe yet, just because your lungs have insisted on it. He pulled Gideon to a stop at the junction and waited for the gray to come up alongside him, and they stood there for a moment, both of them looking at the track. "We're not done," Clara said. She wasn't saying it to him. She was saying it to herself, reminding herself. "No," Samuel said, "but we're closer." She looked at him. Then really looked at him the way she had in the cabin when he'd offered her the wool blanket, that same measuring assessment that was also something else, something that didn't have a clean name, but that Samuel felt in the same place in his chest that had been shifting since the first night. "Samuel," she said. "Yeah, when this is over." She stopped, started again. "If this works, when it's over. I don't have anything. You know that. I don't have a home or money or—" "Clara." He said her name quietly and she stopped. Let's get through the next 2 days first. I know. I just need you to know that I'm not. She was working for the right words and not quite finding them, which was unusual for her, and he understood why. She was trying to say something that mattered to her, and she didn't have practice asking for things without simultaneously explaining why she deserved them. I'm not expecting anything from you beyond what you've already given, she said finally. I want you to know that. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. I'll keep that in mind, he said. And then, because he was a man who had spent 4 years not saying things and was beginning to find the cost of that too high. And you should know that what I've given isn't close to done yet. Something in her face changed. Not dramatically, she was not a dramatic expression kind of person, he was learning. But something shifted behind her eyes, some small warm thing moving in a space that had been cold a long time. All right, she said. They turned south onto the Helena track and rode. The first freight wagon found them 40 minutes later, a broad-shouldered teamster named Burl with a load of winter grain and a face like old saddle leather, who pulled his team to a stop when he saw them coming and took in the situation with the quick eyes of a man accustomed to reading the road for trouble. You two look like hard miles, Burl said, which was the freight wagon equivalent of asking what had happened. Some, Samuel said. Burl looked at the shape of Thomas under Clara's coat. He looked at the horses. He looked behind them at the road they'd come from. Anything following you I need to worry about? Might be men behind us who'd want to know our direction, Samuel said. If anyone asks, we turned north at the junction. Burl chewed this over. He looked at Samuel, then at Clara, then at Thomas, one more time. I got a daughter in Billings, he said. About your age, ma'am. He clicked his tongue to his team, and the wagon began to roll. Turned north at the junction, he said as he passed. I'll remember that. Samuel watched the wagon go. People keep helping us, Clara said. She didn't sound surprised, exactly, more like she was taking note of something she hadn't been prepared for. People don't like Blackthorn, Samuel said. They're afraid of him. That's different from liking him. And when they see a chance to do something about it that won't cost them more than they can afford. He looked at the road ahead. People are mostly all right, Clara, in my experience, when they've got room to be. She was quiet for a moment. I stopped believing that, she said. About 3 years into Blackthorn's ranch. I thought I'd lost it permanently. And now, she looked at the road where the freight wagon had disappeared. Winslow, she said. Burl. Eli Marsh. A pause. You. She said the last word without looking at him straight ahead, the same way she said difficult things straight out into the air without flinching. I reckon I'm revising my position. They made 15 miles before the light started failing, and the cold dropped another 10 degrees. And Samuel began looking at Clara with the specific attention of a man monitoring a situation that was operating at its limits. She hadn't complained. She hadn't asked to stop. But he could see it in the set of her jaw and the way she was holding the reins and the slight forward hunch that said her core was fatiguing and she was compensating with her back. And Thomas had been too quiet for the last hour, and while Samuel knew almost nothing about infants, he knew that too quiet wasn't the same as fine. We stop, he said. We keep going. Clara. He said it firm and quiet, and she heard the difference in it. We stop. 2 hours. The horses need it, and you need it, and Thomas needs it. And if we ride you and him into the ground, we don't make Helena regardless. She looked at him. She wanted to argue. He could see it, the war in her expression, between the urgency that had been driving her for 4 days and the body that was telling her it had reached a wall. 2 hours, she said. 2 hours, he confirmed. There was a stage relay station another mile on. Samuel knew it had stopped there once for water, and they made it as the last of the light died. The station keeper was a small, nervous man named Plum, who took one look at Clara's gray face and the baby she was pulling from the sling, with hands that were barely working anymore, and made a decision that didn't involve any questions at all. He had them inside, and by the fire, in under 2 minutes. Thomas was cold. colder than he should have been. And when Clara unwrapped him in the firelight, his face had a pinched, unhappy quality that was different from his usual infant displeasure, and Clara held him against her chest by the fire, with her hands cupped around his head, and she rocked him and murmured, and didn't look at Samuel, and he didn't say anything. He heated milk. He brought it to her. He sat in the corner, and he watched, and he did not let himself think about what it would mean if the baby was more than cold. 15 minutes by the fire, and Thomas made a sound, a real sound, an indignant squalling, that bounced off the relay station walls, and made Plum jump in his chair, and made Clara close her eyes for one single second, with an expression that was relief so profound it looked almost like pain. "There he is," Samuel said from the corner. "There he is," Clara said, and her voice was not steady at all, and she didn't try to make it so. Thomas ate. Then he slept. Clara sat by the fire with him in her arms and her head back against the wall, and she was asleep before Samuel had finished his coffee, her breathing dropping into the deep, even rhythm of genuine, exhausted rest, and Samuel sat across from her and kept watch and thought about Helena. He had a problem. He'd been turning it over for hours and hadn't told Clara yet because she had enough to carry, and because he needed to think through the shape of it before he said it out loud. The problem was, this Reeves Blackthorn's lawyer kept that office in Helena, and Reeves was smart. Smarter than Holt, smarter than the sheriff in Harlan Creek, probably smarter than Blackthorn himself, in the specific and dangerous way that lawyers could be smart. If Reeves got even a hint from anyone from any of the men Blackthorn had paid along the road that Clara Whitmore was coming to Helena with documents, Reeves would be at Carrie's hearing room door before dawn, with a story already prepared. He would call Clara a thief. He would call the document stolen property. He would have a counter-filing ready that would bury the case in procedural delays long enough for Blackthorn to apply pressure from other directions. The papers had to get to Torrance before Reeves knew they existed, which meant Samuel couldn't ride into Helena in front of anyone who might carry the information forward. He turned this problem over quietly in the small hours of the relay station, while Clara and Thomas slept, and Plum dozed behind his desk, and the fire burned down to coals, and back up again when Samuel fed it. By the time gray light began to come through the cracks in the shutter, he had a shape of a plan. It wasn't comfortable, but it was what they had. He woke Clara gently, a hand on her shoulder, and she came awake the way she always came awake, instantly. Completely no foggy middle ground. "Time," she said. "Dawn," he said. "I need to tell you something." She looked at him, shifted. Thomas checked him, looked back. "Tell me." He told her about Reeves, about the counter-filing, about the problem of arriving in Helena as themselves openly, where any one of Blackthorn's paid eyes could send word ahead to the lawyer's office. Clara listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment the way she was quiet when she was running numbers. "We split up," she said. It wasn't what Samuel had been going to suggest, but it was the same answer from a different direction. "I ride in ahead," he said. "I go to Torrance directly. I tell him what's coming, and I give him enough to act on before Reeves can maneuver." He paused. "You come in behind different road with the papers. Plum knows the back roads into Helena, I'll ask him." "And if Holt catches up to me on the back road," Clara said. Not dramatic, just the question. "Holt doesn't know about the back road," Samuel said. "He's going to expect us on the Helena track because that's the logical route. He'll be watching the Helena track." "You hope." "I know how Holt thinks," Samuel said. "He's systematic. He follows the logical line. It's what makes him effective, and it's what makes him predictable." He looked at her steadily. "You'll have a 3-hour head start on any rider coming from the north, and you'll be on a road nobody who works for Blackthorn has reason to know." Clara looked at Thomas. She looked at the oilskin package, sitting on the station table where she'd set it when she sat down. She looked at Samuel. "If something goes wrong," she said. "Nothing goes wrong," Samuel said. "Samuel." She said his name the way she said things she needed him to hear clearly. "If something goes wrong, if Holt finds me before I reach Helena, if Reeves gets to Carrie first." She held his gaze. The papers are the priority, not me. You understand that. I understand that you believe that, Samuel said. It's not about belief. I'm going to Torrance, Samuel said. You're taking the back road. Nothing goes wrong. She looked at him for a long time. The fire popped. Thomas breathed. All right, she said. He talked to Plum. The station keeper knew the back road, knew it well, had used it himself to avoid a creditor some years past, and still had reason to be glad it existed. He drew the route on a scrap of paper for Clara in 3 quick lines, and Samuel checked it and nodded. They rode out together to the first bend in the Helena track, and then Samuel pulled Gideon to a stop. This was the moment he hadn't let himself look directly at until now. Clara on the gray beside him, Thomas in the sling, the oilskin papers inside her coat, the back road going southwest, and the Helena track going south, and between those 2 directions, everything that mattered hanging in the cold morning air. 3 hours, he said. You ride steady. Don't push the gray past what she can hold. Follow Plum's road to the letter. I know. If anyone comes up behind you. Samuel, she said it softly. I've been managing my own survival for 4 days. I can manage 3 more hours. He looked at her. She was pale and exhausted, and her hands on the reins had a slight tremor that she was controlling rather than feeling, and she was looking at him with those absolutely direct eyes, and there was something in them now that hadn't been there 4 days ago in his cabin. Not just the fierce competence that had been there from the first moment, but something warmer than that, something that had been carefully not named by either of them, and probably wouldn't be named here on a frozen road at dawn, with 4 days of running still in their blood. You're the most capable person I've ever met, Samuel said. He said it the way he said true things flat without decoration, like a statement of surveyed fact. Clara blinked. It was the only exterior evidence of the effect the words had, that single blink. Then she said, Don't say things like that until this is over. I can't afford to feel things right now. Noted, Samuel said. She turned the gray toward the southwest cutoff, and she didn't look back, and Samuel watched her go for exactly 5 seconds, long enough to be sure she was on the right line, not long enough to let the watching become something he couldn't pull himself back from. Then he turned Gideon south, and he rode. He pushed Gideon hard, harder than the horse deserved after the last 2 days, but Gideon had more in him than his breathing suggested, as good horses always do, and they made Helena's outskirts in 2.5 hours. The federal marshal's office sat on 2nd Street, a solid framed building with a government-issue look to it that Samuel had always found obscurely reassuring. It said permanence. It said institution. It said the kind of thing that cost more to knock over than to leave standing. He tied Gideon at the post, took the steps at a controlled pace so as not to draw attention, and pushed the door open. Torrance was behind his desk. The marshal was a lean man in his late 50s with gray in his hair and the kind of eyes that recorded everything and gave back nothing. Not cold exactly, but calibrated. He looked up when Samuel came in, and his expression shifted through recognition to assessment in about half a second. Carter, he said. Marshal? Samuel took off his hat. I need about 15 minutes of your time. I need you to hear it all before you say anything, and I need you to not send anyone to the telegraph before we're done. Torrance looked at him for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands on the desk and said, Close the door. Samuel closed the door and sat down and talked. He was good at being concise. 4 years alone had stripped whatever tendency he'd had toward unnecessary words. He told Torrance about Clara, about the papers, about Blackthorn's pattern of fraudulent land claims across the territory. He told him about the Pruitt family and what he'd seen at the courthouse 2 years ago. He told him about Holt and the pursuit, and Winslow and Eli Marsh, and the back road from Plum's relay station. He told him about the brand on Clara's shoulder. Torrance's face did not change dramatically through any of this. He was a man who'd been a marshal for 14 years and had heard a great many things that should have shocked him, and had learned to process them with the same level face, because the face was a tool, and a tool shouldn't show you what it's feeling. But when Samuel mentioned the brand, something moved behind the marshal's eyes that didn't go away. When does she arrive? Torrance said. 2 hours, Samuel said. Maybe less. Back road from Plum Station. And the papers are with her. Yes. Does Reeves know? Not yet, Samuel said. Not if we move faster than Holt's information. Torrance looked at the desk for a moment. Not at anything on it through it the way a man looks when he's making a sequence of decisions that each depend on the previous one working out. Then he looked up. Carter, he said. I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to answer it straight. All right. The papers, Torrance said. Are they what you believe they are, or are they what someone wants you to believe they are? Samuel held the marshal's gaze. I've seen enough fraudulent documents in my life to know what legitimate ones look like, he said. And I've known Clara Whitmore for 3 days. He paused. I'd stake my life on both. You're staking more than your life, Torrance said. You're staking hers. I know that. Another moment of that calibrated assessment. Then Torrance stood, took his coat from the rack behind his desk and put it on. I'm going to ride out the south end of 2nd Street, he said, and intercept Miss Whitmore's road before she comes into town through the main approach. He picked up his hat. Because if Blackthorne has eyes in Helena, and I have reason to believe he does, I want those papers in my possession before they see her face. Samuel felt something release in his chest that had been locked there for 2 days. I'll come with you. You'll stay here, Torrance said, not unkind, definite. Because the eyes I mentioned are the kind that know your face now after following you 2 days, and I'd rather they watch you sitting still in my office than wonder where you went. Samuel looked at him. You've done your part, Carter, Torrance said. Let me do mine. It was possibly the hardest thing Samuel had been asked to do in 4 years. Harder than the cold riding, and harder than the waiting, and harder even than watching Clara disappear down the southwest cutoff that morning. Sitting still in a marshal's office, while the most important 2 hours of a situation resolved themselves without him. He sat still. He waited. He counted time by the quality of the light coming through the single window of Torrance's office, and he thought about Clara on the back road, and Thomas in the sling, and the papers against her chest, and he thought about Eli Marsh, standing his horse across a frozen road at 22 years old, and he thought about Winslow, with his pre-saddled horses, and Burrell with his grain wagon, and Plum with his fire and his back road map. He thought about how a man could spend 4 years believing that caring about things was the fastest route to losing them. He thought about how wrong it was possible to be. The door opened at the 40-minute mark. Not Torrance. A deputy young official faced clearly sent with a specific message. Marshal Torrance says to tell you they're in, the deputy said. The woman and the child. He's got the papers. He's taking them directly to Judge Carey. Samuel said nothing for a moment. She all right? He said. Yes, sir, the deputy said. Marshal says she's... He paused, clearly relaying words he'd been given specifically. He says she's remarkable. Samuel looked at the window. Yeah, he said. She is. He sat in Torrance's office and waited, and an hour and 20 minutes later the door opened, and Clara Whitmore walked through it with Thomas in her arms, and the oilskin package no longer under her coat, because it was in the hands of a federal marshal on its way to a federal judge. And she stopped when she saw Samuel, and he stood, and they looked at each other across the width of Torrance's office. She had road dust on her face, and her hair had come down on one side, and she was holding Thomas with one arm, and she looked like someone who had been awake for 4 days, and run hard through all of them, and had come out the other side, not broken, but different, refined the way things get refined by pressure, harder and cleaner, and more exactly themselves. Torrance found you all right, Samuel said. He found me, she said. He was... She paused. He was kind about the papers. He looked at them and he didn't say anything for a minute, and then he said, Miss Whitmore, where have you been keeping these? And I said, In my coat, Marshal. And he said, That's the finest coat in the territory, then. Something moved in Samuel's face. The rusty muscles worked harder this time. Almost. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she crossed the office and sat down in the chair across from the one he'd been sitting in, and she put Thomas on her knees facing outward the way babies like. And she looked at Samuel, and she said, It's not over. No, he said. Reeves is going to fight it. Blackthorn's going to hire more lawyers. The process. I know the process will take time, she said. I mean, it's not over today, right now. Holt is still in the territory. Holt's not going to touch you in a federal marshal's office building, Samuel said. Today, she said. Today, he agreed. She nodded. Thomas grabbed her thumb with both his small hands and she looked down at him, and the expression on her face was that complicated braided thing, love and fear and ferocity. But there was something else in it now, something that hadn't been there in the cabin or on the mountain road or at Winslow's station. Something that might have been, if you were being precise about it, the first careful tentative beginning of something that was going to eventually become peace. Samuel, she said, not looking up from Thomas. Yeah, the man you used to be, she said. Before the mountain, before 4 years of not caring about things. She looked up. I think he's back. Samuel looked at her. The words hit him somewhere he wasn't entirely prepared for. Not the sentiment he'd been feeling the truth of it for 2 days and had no argument with it. It was the way she said it, not as comfort, not as a compliment, as an observation, as a fact that she had measured carefully and was reporting accurately, the way she said everything. He's rusty, Samuel said. He'll work the rust off, she said. Thomas blew a small bubble and then looked extremely satisfied with himself. And Clara looked at him, and the beginning of peace thing in her expression settled in a fraction more. Outside, somewhere across Helena, a federal judge was opening an oilskin package. 15 years of William Blackthorne's empire had 48 hours left in it, though none of them knew that yet. What they knew was the warmth of the office and the weight of the road behind them, and Thomas's hands wrapped around his mother's thumb, and 2 people sitting across from each other in the space that comes after the worst of it, where the accounting of what happened begins to be possible. The door opened. Torrance came back in. He looked at them both. Then he looked at Clara specifically. And he said, Judge Carey has the documents. He's called an emergency session for tomorrow morning. He set his hat on the desk. Miss Whitmore, I'm going to need you to be prepared to testify. Clara looked at the marshal. She straightened her spine, that specific straightening that Samuel had first seen in the corner of his cabin firelight on her face, and a broken pistol in her shaking hands, and she said without hesitation, without the slightest tremor, Tell me when and where, Marshal. Torrance nodded. He looked at Samuel. Something passed between them. Not words, the thing that passes between men who have sized each other up in a serious situation and reached a conclusion about what the other is. Good man Carter, Torrance said. Samuel looked at Clara. I had help, he said. Torrance gave them a room at the back of the marshal's building that night. It wasn't much a cot, a wood stove, a single window that looked out onto the alley behind 2nd Street, but it had a door that locked, and it was warm, and it wasn't a mountain road, and Clara sat on the edge of the cot with Thomas in her lap and didn't say anything for a long time. Samuel sat in the one chair and didn't push her. He'd learned in 5 days what some people never learned about Clara Whitmore, that her silences weren't absence. They were her doing her most serious thinking, and interrupting them was like pulling bread out of the oven before it finished. You got something, but it wasn't what it was supposed to be. Thomas fell asleep in her lap. The stove ticked. Somewhere out on 2nd Street, a door closed and boots moved across a boardwalk and faded. Tomorrow, Clara said. Tomorrow. Samuel agreed. I've never testified before a judge. I know. I've never been in a courtroom, she said. Not as anything other than not as someone whose opinion was asked. She looked down at Thomas. Blackthorne took us to a hearing once, about a lease agreement one of the other workers had signed. Blackthorne's lawyer did all the talking. The worker just stood there. She was quiet for a moment. He stood there and answered yes or no, and nothing he said mattered, because the document said what the document said, and the document was Blackthorne's. Tomorrow, Samuel said, the documents are yours. She looked at him. Carey is going to ask you to walk him through them, Samuel said. What each one is, where it came from, how you came to have it. You know those papers better than anyone alive. You kept them for years. You organized them. You understood what they meant before any lawyer did. He held her gaze. Just tell him what you know, that's all. What if Reeves is there? He will be, Samuel said. Torrance told me. Reeves filed a motion this evening to have the session closed on grounds of stolen property. Carrie denied it. Something moved in his expression. Carrie doesn't like Reeves. That's on the record. Something that was not quite a smile moved across Clara's face. Not the real thing, she was too tired and too wound up for the real thing tonight, but the shape of one. Get some sleep, Samuel said. I'll be in the hall, Samuel. She said it quietly. You don't have to sit in the hall. You've been awake for 2 days. I've been awake for longer than that and been fine. Samuel. He looked at her. Sleep, she said. Torrance has men on the building. Holt isn't going to come through a federal marshal's office with deputies on every door. She shifted Thomas to the cot and laid him down carefully, and then looked at Samuel with the direct practicality that was the thing he'd first noticed about her, and the thing he thought he might spend a long time continuing to notice. There's a cot and a chair. I don't need both. He slept in the chair. It was, he would think later, one of the better nights of sleep he'd had in 4 years, which said something either about exhaustion or about the specific quality of not being alone. He woke before dawn with the particular alertness of a man whose body had decided it was done sleeping, regardless of what his mind thought, and Clara was already awake, sitting on the edge of the cot with Thomas, who had announced his morning requirements, with the diplomatic subtlety of a small cannon. Samuel warmed milk on the wood stove and brought it to her and went to the window, while she fed the baby and watched the alley go from dark to gray to the particular pale gold of a winter Helena dawn. He thought about what the day was going to be. He thought about Reeves, who was probably awake already, probably writing things, probably drafting the argument he would make to turn evidence into accusation and a witness into a thief. Reeves was the kind of lawyer who was most dangerous when he had the night to prepare, and he'd had the night. Samuel thought about the papers. He thought about the Pruitt family somewhere in the valley, probably still not knowing that today might be the first day of the rest of their lives looking different. He thought about Eli Marsh. Do you think he's all right? Clara said from the cot. She was looking at Thomas, but she meant Eli. I think Holt took his rifle and sent him back to the ranch, Samuel said. Probably told Blackthorne he was useless. He paused. Which means Blackthorne fires him. Which means Eli Marsh is out of a job and out of Blackthorne's orbit before the hammer comes down today. He looked at the window. Might be the best thing that ever happened to him. Or Holt hurt him. Holt's not in the business of hurting boys, Samuel said. He's in the business of results. Eli didn't produce a result, so Eli gets discarded. That's how it works with men like Holt. He turned from the window. Eli knew that when he made his choice. Clara looked up from Thomas. You sound like you respect him. I do, Samuel said. He was scared and 22, and he made the harder call. He picked up his hat from the floor beside the chair. That deserves respect. She looked at him steadily for a moment. Then, like you were. I'm not 22. No, she said, but you were scared. He held her gaze. Yes, he said, I was. She nodded, accepting this, and looked back at Thomas, and the thing between them that hadn't been named settled in the room like the warmth from the wood stove present, real, not requiring acknowledgement to exist. Torrance came for them at 7. He had a deputy with him named Aldous, who was built like a load-bearing wall, and had the quiet, permanent manner of a man who had decided sometime in his 20s that excitement was for other people. Aldous would take Clara and Thomas to the courthouse. Samuel would come separately with Torrance. Why separately? Samuel asked. Because I want 2 paths into that building, Torrance said, and I want Reeves watching one of them while the other one walks in. He looked at Samuel in the particular way he had, assessing direct, not unkind. You're the distraction, Carter. You all right with that? Been called worse, Samuel said. Clara was dressed and ready and holding Thomas with the particular composed uprightness she'd had from the beginning. The spine, the chin, the gaze that went directly at whatever it was looking at, and didn't apologize for looking. She had smoothed her hair, and there was nothing to be done about the road wear on her coat, but the coat was buttoned and straight, and she looked. Samuel thought like exactly what she was, a woman who had something important to say and intended to say it. Torrance looked at her. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "When Reeves speaks, and he will speak probably before you've finished your first sentence, I need you to let him finish. Don't answer him. Don't look at him. Look at Carrie and say what you were saying and let Carrie handle Reeves. And if Carrie doesn't handle him, he will," Torrance said. "But you have to give him the opening." Clara looked at the marshal. "I've spent 7 years letting other people speak over me," she said. "I'm not doing it today." Torrance studied her for a moment. Something in his expression shifted, not quite a smile. Something that had more weight than a smile. "No," he said. "What I'm saying is, you don't need to fight Reeves. Carrie will fight Reeves. Your job is to speak to Carrie, not to Reeves." He paused. "You understand the difference?" Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes." "Good," Torrance said. "Then let's go." Samuel went with Torrance through the front of the marshal's building out onto 2nd Street and north toward the federal courthouse 2 blocks up. It was early, but Helena was already awake. Freight wagons, early rising merchants, a group of men moving with the purposeful pace of people who had somewhere to be. Samuel kept his pace easy and his hat on and his eyes forward. He didn't have to wait long. A man fell into step beside them on the courthouse steps. Well-dressed, briefcase in hand, the particular kind of smooth that expensive suits and expensive education applied over whatever a man actually was underneath. Reeves. "Marshal Torrance," Reeves said. "And Mr. Carter." He said Samuel's name the way you say a name when you want the person to know you've done your homework. "I had hoped to speak with you before the session." "We're on our way to the session," Torrance said. "It won't take long," Reeves said. "I want to make a proposal." He kept pace with them, up the steps, smooth and unhurried, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man who believed that the right words in the right order solved most problems. "My client is prepared to be generous. The woman, Miss Whitmore, is not going to be prosecuted for the documents she removed from the ranch. Mr. Blackthorne is prepared to formalize that agreement in writing, signed and witnessed. All he asks in return is that the documents be returned and the matter be considered resolved." Samuel kept walking. Additionally, Reeves said, Mr. Blackthorne is prepared to offer Miss Whitmore a sum of money. A fair sum enough to establish herself and the child comfortably somewhere outside the territory, in exchange for her signed agreement not to pursue further legal action against Reeves, Torrance said, and his voice had the quality of a door closing. "This conversation is taking place on the steps of a federal courthouse at 7:15 in the morning, on the day of a judicial session I have facilitated. Whatever you have to say to me, you can say it in front of Judge Carey." He pushed the courthouse door open and walked through it. Samuel stopped on the step and looked at Reeves. The lawyer looked back at him with those smooth, calculated eyes and said, "Mr. Carter, you're a man who chose to live alone on a mountain, a man who values his quiet." He paused. "This is going to be very loud before it's over, for everyone involved." Samuel looked at him. "I reckon it will be," he said, and walked through the door. The federal courtroom was a high-ceilinged room that smelled of woodwork and old paper, and the particular gravity of a place where serious things had been decided. Carey was already at the bench, a compact man in his 60s, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and the kind of face that had been weathered by years of being unimpressible. He had the oilskin package open in front of him, and he was reading. Clara was already there. She was seated at the table to the left of the room's center, with Aldous standing near the door, and she had Thomas in the crook of her left arm and the composure of a woman who had decided at some point in the last 12 hours that she was done being afraid of rooms. She looked at Samuel when he came in, and something in his chest moved when he saw it, saw the fear that wasn't entirely gone, but was no longer driving the way it had moved to the back seat, and she was behind the wheel. He sat behind her in the gallery, just one row back, close enough that she'd know he was there without having to turn around. Reeves came in behind him, with a younger man carrying 2 heavy briefcases, and they took the table to the right, and Reeves arranged his papers with the focused speed of a man who had done this many times and was confident in his performance. Carey looked up from the oilskin documents. "This session is called to order," he said. "No preamble, no ceremony." He had the voice of a man who considered unnecessary words to be someone else's problem. "Miss Whitmore." Clara stood. "You prepared these documents," Carey said. It was not entirely a question. "I organized them," Clara said. "Most of them are original documents from Blackthorn Ranch operations. Contracts, land transfer agreements, correspondence. I added notation to several of them identifying the context. Sit down," Carey said, not unkindly. "I'm going to go through each one, and I'm going to ask you questions. Answer what you know. Don't speculate about what you don't. Can you do that?" "Yes, Your Honor," Clara said, and sat. Reeves was on his feet before the first document was finished. "Your Honor, I must object to this proceeding on grounds that the documents before the court constitute stolen property and their provenance. Mr. Reeves." Carey didn't raise his voice. He simply stopped looking at the document and looked at Reeves instead. "I denied your motion last evening. Sit down." "Your Honor, my client's rights." Mr. Reeves. Still the same quiet, inexorable tone. "The next time you speak without being addressed, you will conduct the remainder of this proceeding from the hallway. Sit down." Reeves sat. And then something happened that Samuel would think about for the rest of his life. Clara Whitmore began to talk, not nervously, not with the hesitations of someone performing testimony they'd rehearsed. She talked the way she did, everything directly, clearly, with the specific authority of a person who had lived with this information for 7 years, and turned it over so many times she knew every face of it. She talked about the Pruitt claim and the forged notary seal. She talked about the Alderman family, whose land was taken through a fraudulent tax assessment that Blackthorn's paid man at the county office had manufactured. She talked about the Kowalski brothers and the Martinez family and 3 separate homesteaders along the Ridley Creek watershed who had each been told their deeds were invalid and each been offered a fraction of their land's value in exchange for quiet departure. She named every name. She cited every date. She identified the specific document that supported each claim and the specific flaw in Blackthorn's paperwork that exposed the fraud, and she did it with the precision of someone who had been keeping a 7-year ledger of injustice and knew every entry by heart. Carey listened. He asked questions. Specific, detailed questions that told Samuel the judge had read the documents carefully the previous evening and was now testing the witness against them, checking for inconsistency, for fabrication, for the places where a story built from lies develops cracks under examination. There were no cracks. Samuel watched Reeves across the room. He watched the lawyer's careful face go through changes that it was trying very hard not to show the first 20 minutes of flat professional attention. The second 20 minutes of something tightening around the eyes. The third 20 minutes of writing things down very fast, not for presentation, but for the specific purpose of keeping his hands busy while he processed the fact that this was not going the way he had prepared for it to go. Because he had prepared for a frightened woman with stolen documents and a story she couldn't substantiate. What he had gotten was Clara Whitmore. And those were not the same thing at all. It took 2.5 hours. At the end of it, Carey put the last document down and took off his spectacles and cleaned them with a cloth from his breast pocket, which Samuel had come to understand watching the judge's habits across the morning, was what Carey did when he had reached a conclusion and was giving himself a moment before he stated it. He put the spectacles back on. "Mr. Reeves," he said, "you may respond." Reeves stood. He was still smooth. Samuel would give him that. He was a professional, and professionals hold their form even when the ground is going out from under them. He argued for 20 minutes. He called the documents falsified. He called Clara's testimony motivated by personal grievance. He produced his own documents, counterfilings affidavits, from men whose names Samuel recognized as Blackthorne's paid associates, and he laid them on the clerk's table with the confidence of a man playing his best hand. Carey read everything Reeves submitted with the same careful attention he'd given Clara's papers. Then he looked at Reeves. "Mr. Reeves," he said, "I have been on this circuit for 11 years. In that time, I have reviewed a considerable volume of land documentation from this territory." He held up one of Reeves's affidavits. "This notary seal was discontinued in 1873. The document it appears on is dated 1876. He set it down. "This transfer agreement bears the signature of a county recorder who died of cholera in the summer of 1875. The transfer is dated 1877. He picked up a third document and then set it back down without comment. "I'm not going to go through all of them, Mr. Reeves. I've seen enough." Reeves stood very still. "I am issuing a federal warrant for the arrest of William Blackthorne on 14 counts of land fraud, 2 counts of filing false instruments with a federal court, and 1 count of unlawful labor coercion." Carey's voice was absolutely level, not angry, not theatrical, just a man reading out what the evidence required. "I am additionally referring the matter of the documents submitted by Mr. Reeves this morning to the federal prosecutor's office, as several of them appear to constitute obstruction." He looked at Reeves directly. "You may want to consult with your own counsel, Mr. Reeves." Something passed through Reeves's smooth face. Something that had been underneath it all along, hidden below the expensive suit and the briefcases and the professional ease. It was the look of a man who has bet everything on one number and watched the wheel come up wrong. He sat down. Torrance was already moving. Samuel didn't watch him go. He was watching Clara. She had sat through the last 20 minutes of Reeves's response without moving, without looking at Reeves, with her attention on Carey the entire time. And when Carey pronounced the warrant, she did not react visibly. Not a breath released, not a tremor, not the vindicated outburst that the situation might have licensed. She sat completely still and held Thomas against her chest and looked at the judge's bench. And then slowly she looked down at Thomas, and she said something too quiet to hear from the gallery. Samuel didn't ask what it was. He knew. He could see it in the shape of the words, 2 syllables, the first one high and the second one low, a declaration and a promise at the same time. "We're safe." Samuel sat in the gallery of a federal courtroom in Helena, Montana, and felt something complete itself in his chest that had been incomplete for 4 years. Not fixed, he understood enough about his own damage to know that what had broken in him didn't simply reassemble because something good happened. But the fracture had been bearing weight again for 5 days now, and weight on a fracture, if the fracture has been knitting, is not the same as weight on a break. He was tired. He was cold in his bones from 3 days of mountain riding. He had spent the last 5 days running on almost no sleep and less certainty, and a decision he'd made in a doorway in a blizzard that had turned out to be the most consequential decision of the last 4 years of his life. He sat in the gallery, and he looked at Clara Whitmore, and he thought, well, there it is. Torrance came back into the courtroom an hour later, with the particular look of a man whose morning has been more productive than most of his weeks. Holt had been picked up at a boarding house on the north end of Helena by 2 deputies who had found him apparently in the process of shaving. He had not resisted. He was, Torrance said, a man who knew when a situation had changed and was smart enough to change with it. He asked for a lawyer immediately, which Torrance considered a reasonable request from a man looking at an accessory charge. Blackthorne himself was arrested at the ranch by 3 federal deputies who rode out that afternoon. The ranch hands, 12 of them minus Eli Marsh and minus Holt, had by all accounts stood in the yard and watched without particular distress the way employees of a failing business watch the moment when it becomes official. Several of them, Torrance said, had already asked about the possibility of providing statements in exchange for consideration. People, Clara said when Torrance reported this. They were always going to turn the moment it was safe to. Yes, Torrance said. He built the whole thing on fear, she said. Not bitterly. More like a person confirming a theorem they'd suspected. Fear only works while the fearful thing is still uncertain. The moment it becomes certain. She looked at Thomas. People remember who they actually are. Torrance looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Samuel. I'm going to need both of you to remain available in Helena for the next week at least, he said. Additional testimony documentation of the journey formal deposition. He paused. I can make arrangements at the Federal Hotel. No, Samuel said. Torrance looked at him. She's not staying in a hotel, Samuel said. She needs... He stopped. He looked at Clara and had the brief but vivid experience of a man who has just spoken on someone else's behalf and is checking to see if they wanted him to. Unless you want the hotel, he said. Clara looked at him. The thing that was not quite a smile was back, and this time it was closer to the real thing than it had ever been. What's the alternative? She said. I know a family in Helena, Samuel said. The Garveys. Ruth Garvey will have Clara and Thomas in her guest room before I finish asking, and she'll consider it a personal insult if I offer to pay for anything. He looked at Torrance. You can find us there. Torrance considered this. Ruth Garvey, he said. Herman Garvey's wife. Yes. Herman Garvey who testified in the Tillman case 3 years ago. The same, Torrance nodded. I know where it is, he said, and turned back to his desk, which seemed to be his way of indicating that he considered the matter settled and had other things to do. Ruth Garvey was a broad, warm woman in her 50s who had raised 6 children and was currently in the process of raising 2 grandchildren, and had, as far as Samuel could tell, an infinite capacity for absorbing more people into her orbit without the slightest reduction in the quality of care extended to each one. She opened her door, took one look at Clara and Thomas and said, "Get inside." In a tone that was both command and welcome, which was a combination Samuel had only ever heard her pull off, Clara stepped over the threshold and into Ruth Garvey's house, and stood in the hallway for a moment, and Samuel watched her stand there and take in the warmth and the smell of something cooking, and the sound of children somewhere in the back rooms. And he watched something happen to her face that he hadn't seen happen before. She didn't cry. She wasn't a person who did that easily, and he wasn't surprised. But her face, that composed, direct, carefully maintained face, softened in a way that showed what was underneath it, and what was underneath it was not hard at all. What was underneath it was someone who had been holding herself together across 5 days of survival-grade stress with the specific purpose of getting to somewhere safe, and who had just quietly and without announcement arrived. Thomas chose this moment to wake up and announce his views on the situation. Ruth Garvey took him from Clara's arms with the automatic competence of a woman who had held a great many babies and said, "You go sit down, sweetheart," and steered Clara toward the parlor with the authority of someone who understood that a person who had been strong long enough sometimes needs to be told very firmly to stop for a minute. Samuel stood in the hallway. Herman Garvey appeared from the direction of the kitchen. A stout, good-natured man who shook Samuel's hand and looked at the general state of him and said, "You look like you need a meal and a bath, and about 3 days of sleep." "Probably in that order," Samuel said. "Ruth'll see to the woman and the baby," Herman said. "Come eat." Samuel ate. He ate more than he'd eaten in a single sitting in 4 years, which Ruth Garvey took as a personal validation of her cooking, and continued to supply without being asked. He answered Herman's questions, the general shape of things enough for the man to understand what had happened, without every specific, and drank 2 cups of coffee, and felt the road coming out of his bones slowly, the way warmth reaches the deep cold only gradually. Later, Clara found him on the Garveys' back porch. She had Thomas asleep against her shoulder, and she'd taken her hair down and brushed it, and she was wearing a shawl that Ruth had probably pressed on her over her own coat, and she came out and stood beside him, and they looked at the thin winter stars coming out over Helena, and were quiet together for a while. "What happens now?" she said. Not to him specifically, to the question itself, the one that comes when the emergency is over, and the thing you were running toward becomes the place you're standing. "The trial," Samuel said. "Blackthorn's lawyers will file delays. It'll take months, maybe longer. But Carey's got the documents, and Torrance's got Blackthorn and Holt, and that doesn't come undone." He paused. "The Pruitt family gets their land back. The others, some of them will. The territory's going to look different." "That's not what I meant," Clara said. He looked at her. She was looking at the stars with that steady, direct attention, not looking at him, which he had come to understand, was what she did when she was about to say something that mattered to her more than usual. "I don't have anywhere to go," she said. "That's just a fact. My mother's house is gone. I can't go back to the valley. While Blackthorn's men are still there, even under arrest, my cousin in Millerton, she has her own family and her own hardship, and I won't put Thomas on her charity long term." She paused. "I'm not asking you for anything. I want you to know that. I'm just thinking out loud." "Clara," Samuel said. "I'll figure it out," she said. "I always have." "I know you will," he said. "You'd figure out how to survive on the surface of the moon if you had to, and you'd do it with better records than anyone else who ever tried." He looked at her profile. "That's not the question." She turned and looked at him. Then, and in the faint light from the Garveys' windows, he could see her face clearly. The road wear and the exhaustion and the beginning of peace that had been coming in since the courthouse, and the warmth that was underneath all of it. The warmth that had been there in his cabin when she sang to Thomas at 3 in the morning and he had pretended not to hear. "The mountain cabin," Samuel said. "It's not much. It needs work on the north wall, and the loft floor has a board that needs replacing, and the well is slow in winter." He kept his voice level, the way he said things that mattered, flat, factual, no performance. "But it's solid, and it's far enough from the valley that nobody's going to bother you while the trial's pending, and I know the trails, and I know the land, and—" He stopped, looked at the stars. "And I don't want to go back up there alone," he said. "That's the plainest way I know to say it." The silence after that was the specific kind of silence that follows a true thing said plainly. Clara looked at him for a long time. "The north wall," she said. "What? You said the north wall needs work." "It does," Samuel said. "The chinking's gone on the lower course. Takes a full day to do it right." "I can do chinking," she said. He looked at her. "You can do chinking, too." "My father built our house," Clara said. "He taught me." Something in her face was doing a complicated thing, years of held-back things moving close to the surface without quite breaking through. He said a person who can't maintain their own walls is always going to be at someone else's mercy. Samuel thought about that. He thought about a girl learning from her father, and a father who understood something real about the world, and left his daughter with the tools to survive it, and then died before he could see how well they'd served her. "He sounds like a good man," Samuel said. "He was the best man I knew," Clara said. "Until recently." Samuel looked at her. She was looking at him directly. The way she always looked at things, straight on, no flinching, no apology for seeing clearly. And what she was looking at right now was him with the same clear-eyed attention she'd given the courthouse, and Carrie, and the papers, and every true thing she'd ever had to face. And Samuel felt it land in the same place in his chest that everything she did landed, and he thought, there it is again. "Clara," he said. "Don't say anything careful," she said. "I've had a very long week, and I don't have the patience for careful tonight." Something happened to his face then. The muscles that hadn't worked properly in 4 years worked. Not rusty this time all the way. He smiled. It was a small smile, nothing that would have impressed anyone who hadn't watched him try to make it happen for 5 days. But it was real, and Clara looked at it, and something in her face answered it, and it was not quite a smile from her either. It was better than that. It was the thing that comes before a smile, the moment when the decision is made, but the expression hasn't caught up yet, and in some ways, that moment is more true than the smile itself. Thomas made a small sound on her shoulder. They both looked at him. He was still asleep. His small face pressed against his mother's neck, one fist curled under his chin. He had in 5 days been carried through a blizzard and down a mountain in the cold dark, and through a frozen creek and across territory that would have broken most adults. And he had done it all without complaint, beyond the universal infant complaints that were really more philosophical statements about the general inadequacy of the world than anything personal. He was going to be remarkable. Samuel thought this with a certainty that surprised him with its completeness. This child is going to be remarkable. And then behind that thought, quieter, like something said in another room that you hear through the wall, I would very much like to see it. The north wall, Clara said again. Back to the practical the way she always came back to the practical, which was not a retreat from the other things but a way of carrying them. The north wall, Samuel said. The loft floor. One board. The slow well. She tilted her head slightly. How slow? Slower than I'd like in January, he said. Fine by March. She considered this with the focused attention she'd given the documents that morning, turning it over, checking the angles. I'll need... She stopped, looked at Thomas. He'll need things. In the spring, when he starts to move around. We'll get what he needs, Samuel said. She looked at him. We, she said. We, he said. The word sat between them in the cold Helena night, simple and specific, and carrying everything that had accumulated in 5 days on a mountain and a road and a courtroom. Every piece of the journey, every decision, every moment, when it could have gone differently, and hadn't every stranger who'd helped, and every obstacle that hadn't stopped them, and 2 people who had found each other in a blizzard with a broken pistol and a sleeping baby, and a mark on a shoulder that someone had put there to say you are owned, and who had ridden together to the place where that mark meant nothing anymore. A light went on inside the Garvey house. Ruth Garvey's voice saying something to someone in the kitchen, warm and ordinary, and carrying through the window the comfortable sound of a household that had been a household for a long time. Clara leaned back against the porch post and shifted Thomas on her shoulder and looked at the stars, and Samuel stood beside her. And they did not need to say anything else, because the important things had been said, and the rest could wait for tomorrow and the day after and all the days after that. He had come down the mountain for flour and salt pork and ammunition and 11 days of silence. He had found a woman in the corner of his own cabin with a broken pistol and a sleeping baby, and a scar that someone had put on her to make sure she'd never forget what they thought she was. He had watched her walk into a federal courtroom and dismantle 15 years of William Blackthorne's empire, with nothing but the truth told plainly to the right man at the right time. He had smiled for the first time in 4 years on a porch in Helena, Montana in January. Samuel Carter had spent 4 years on a mountain, deciding that caring about things was the surest way to lose them. Clara Whitmore had spent 7 years in someone else's captivity, deciding the same thing about trusting people. They were both wrong. And they knew it now. That was enough. That was everything.